That's great. Nice. So the audio is working perfectly now, no?
Yes, very good.
Yeah, and now we're live. So
Yes.
I can see the yellow one thing there. Um, well, I mean, it took us a little bit of a break, so I have to put my thoughts again together. But I guess I left when I wanted to address the issue of autonomy, since, as you know, Pelin, next week I will be in a conference in Greece that's called Autonomia, right? And they asked me to talk about this, and I've actually been doing quite a lot of reading and trying to figure out exactly why I was invited, first of all, in that conference. But most importantly, I think, I mean, to get a sense of what they're talking about. I mean, as with many things that I confront in every day, especially these intellectual discourses that come from the left, I tend not to immediately reject them. No, I mean, obviously there is some intensity and there's some logic behind many of the cryouts, that constitute the lines of autonomy today. Historically, I don't want to go way back, but I think in my country, in Mexico, an enormous influence can be taken from the Zapatista movement, which many people still consider like a primary example of autonomy, basically the proclamation of some kind of self-determination, which I think it's at the heart of a lot of the philosophy and the thinking behind the conditions of autonomy. Of course, in the case of the Greek sense, just to go back to this invitation, I've been going a lot through the text of Castoriadis, which is one of the main sort of philosophers that discusses these things. And I mean, I see a thread, not a threat, a thread. And a very clear thread as a reaction, and perhaps not a negative reaction, not a positive reaction, but a clear reaction to what Teddy and Fonna were mentioning in regards to their students, and I would add my students also, with complete disbelief in the governmental apparatus, in governance, in anything related politics, pretty much. And politics, I'm saying with a not a capital P, right? Not the politics, but the petty politics that are played in the everyday, in the state, in the cities, in all kinds of governments that rule our city, our conditions of daily life today. And this is, I think, at the heart of the contemporary question. I don't think we can reject the desires and the sensibility of the younger generations vis-a-vis what they have seen as a failed attempts to get some kind of accountability from governments, to get some sense of responsibility from governments towards their citizens. And I think most importantly, the lack of response of governments towards the majority of its citizens. As we know, the condition of most governments today is to empower a certain kind of class, and rejecting by that definition the empowerment of most of us. And I include myself in this, even though, of course, I'm in a very specific position within the spectrum of society. And so when you hear those cries of younger generations in terms of autonomy, I think they are truly referring to a possibility or a certain capacity to self-determinate what their futures would be, to self-determinate their own right to exist, their own right to populate an urban environment, or not even an urban environment, just an environment in general. And that a lot of those rights, so the rights that I'm talking about, and specifically I love to talk about the right to the city, but it could be any other kind of right, we know that been taken away through these 40 periods of neoliberal governance. Of course, that not to discount the previous capitalistic periods, but it's very clear that there's been a tremendous erosion of our rights, and that erosion has come from government. And once, as a youth or not youth, you realize that then I really don't blame, and I somehow have become quite supportive on the understanding of the trying to, again, project the possibility for some kind of self-determination. Now the question is, how would that look like? And then when you bring the issue of infrastructure, then it becomes super complicated, because in the most banal form, self-determination means it's a community that can set their own rules, their own laws, right? I mean, there's the autonomia from the Greek, autonomo and nomos, so this is some, I mean, if you come from the etymology, it means precisely that you can self-determine, you can self-create your own laws to govern a specific kind of society. But we have seen that through the 20th century and before, communities of 100 people, 200 people, 300 people that exist all over the place that decide to say to the world or to the urban world or to any regular world, we don't want to deal with you anymore, and we're going to separate ourselves, and we're going to, buy a plot somewhere in the middle of the Amazon or in the middle of a mountain or something like that, and separate ourselves and create our own structures. And I think that's the most sort of elementary, and I won't say banal, because there's obviously a lot of effort in this, and it's a lot to learn also from these processes, but it's that level where we are not understanding what it truly means to have a certain level of autonomy. I mean, we cannot kid ourselves in order to think that those communities that have managed to separate or to create a certain self-determination is mostly fake, because they are still governed by many of the rules, and laws that are imposed, continue to be imposed on them. Not only in terms of the government structures, but I think most importantly, the economic laws and the distribution laws and the commodity sort of circulation of things, etc. People still need, even though if you're planting your own garden, you will still need, for sure, certain components that are not locally produced or not locally structured. So there's, in one hand, a young sort of direction towards that, local, autonomous, self-determination, almost separation from the conditioning of government, right? That is not the type of autonomy that I have started to get more interested in. Again, I mentioned that for me, that's a very simplistic way of understanding this. But the most complex way for me, or one of the most complex directions that we can look into autonomy, is look at the role, first of all, of the state and the economy, the political economy, of the 20th century's role, of the government in general, of the state. And one can read a series of, I would say, two main paradigms over the 20th century. A situation where the construction of the state exists, it overpowers through its laws and structures and rules. That state has to survive by asking their citizens to give something out of, in exchange of the state guaranteeing certain rights. In many cases, the citizen, what it does is that it gives away, in most cases, civic engagement, whatever that can be. Just a simple act of voting could be one of those, sort of things that we are supposed to do as citizens. But in our contemporary times, there's a very strong fight over the decision of taxing people, of the fiscal incentives that government creates and the fiscal situations the government receives from its citizens, right? So a lot of the fight since the construction of the state has been focused or structured around the capacity of government to manipulate our contributions, whether, again, it's sort of sweat equity or civil contributions or participation or voting or being part of a community board or whatever that you call it. But there's a big emphasis on the economic term, right? There is a tremendous input that we give to governments, us, through our fiscal contributions, for governments to function. So governments would not function without the citizens' contribution, in terms of, again, on all of these facets. If we look at the early 20th century, we have a condition where the state took all this money and, through the state of governance, decided what would it do? No, so if we look at the welfare state that somehow Teddy was alluding to, clearly there were some welfare states that were more socially minded, some a bit less, but they decided where we're going to construct, a few social housing here, affordable housing there. We're going to construct a sports center there, a theater facility, a museum. We're going to do infrastructure for our citizens. And the governments in general were taking most of the decisions over its citizens. Now, looking at and reading a lot about the consequences of such moments, and I think you can find the best of the critiques in the work of Henri Lefebvre, where he despised in many of his writings the welfare state of the French welfare state, precisely because it was that apparatus that was determining what citizens should be, what citizens should live, how citizens should act, where would they go, where would they go, what would they listen, what wouldn't they listen. In short, I mean, there was big critique on how the welfare state was producing a series of automatons. People that were designed, societies that were constructed under such, very, very top-down structures. And then we can begin to read, before even Lefebvre, of course, the cries of the Dadaists and the Situationists, and all those kinds of movements that rebelled against the boredom that modernist welfare state was producing. So we have a very long period, of course, very strange, and it had been dismantled slowly, of government being the depository of my contributions and government deciding what to do with my contributions. I personally don't want to go back to that part, to that moment. Although most of my friends, not most, a lot of my friends from the left still have a big belief that government should be held accountable and responsible and so forth, therefore turning a little bit, the clock back into a moment where that was, again, the construction of the welfare state deciding over what you're supposed to do. Now, on one hand, I have ideological problems with that idea, and I've sided a lot with Henri Lefebvre's position. But on the other hand, even if I wanted it, I think what the second paradigm has done, which is the neoliberal shift, has created an impossible form of getting back into that. Even if I wanted, to hold the government accountable, the government structures that support the welfare state all have been dismantled. They don't exist anymore. City planning departments are far smaller than they used to be. I mean, and they only do zoning by now, right? I mean, that's basically, they're just technicians. Health industries, even infrastructure construction has been all privatized, which comes back to that other paradigm where the governments decided that the contributions of their citizens were going to be given to private entities, which is obviously what we are suffering today. Private entities prioritizing profit over anything else, and therefore, the site of a neoliberal city that we look into. Now, my frame over the conditions of autonomy and relations to infrastructure and so forth has to do more with the possibility of thinking structures that could begin to use government to empower public, not to empower itself, as it was in the welfare state, not to empower private entities, but to enter into a situation where a lot of the citizens' contributions are filtered through a condition of the state that gives back those contributions into decision-making, decision power of its citizens in itself. And that, for me, constructs a certain kind of autonomy. It's not an autonomy where we are rejecting the government, but it's an autonomy where the government is there to facilitate and to empower the citizens' capacities to decide over their own future, over their own conditions, over their own structures. In short, I mean, that definition of the right to the city, which is very beautiful, that says, the right to the city is nothing more than a right to decide over over our own environment, of how we want to live our own environment, what we want to do. And so a lot of my work recently has been focused on how the hell, I mean, first of all, thinking, how the hell to produce those shifts? No, I'm not talking attacking the government in these welfare conditions. I'm not talking continuing that idea that the private enterprises, mostly corporate enterprises, should deal with it. But it's how to utilize the citizens' contributions, empowered by government, and to take it back and empower to its citizens. No? And a lot of our projects recently have been dealing with that conundrum. I mean, of course, it's a very long paradigm that I'm discussing. I mean, the first paradigm, the welfare state, was a construction that lasted, I don't know, 100 years or perhaps even more. We've been already 40 years of a neoliberal paradigm, you know, where most of the resources of the citizens go back to the private and for the very specific communities. But I do think that we have to begin to shift into thinking of a third paradigm. And I don't want to say like a third way, because that's not what I'm talking about, no. But also to have a realistic understanding that we cannot function without the state, but the state has to have a different role. And when I mention that we cannot function without the state, the role of infrastructure, I think, or infrastructure itself, is what can teach us that. Infrastructure, I mean, like, can you imagine a self-determined community in the middle of the Amazon trying to install their sewage treatment plants or their electricity networks to different places, their internet infrastructure, whatever type of infrastructure, even physical infrastructure we're talking about, requires the production of a lot of debt, and therefore requires the structure of a large sort of entity, which in this case is the state, but most importantly requires a lot of coordination, which is out of the hands of a locality. You know? So again, I'm not sure if I'm being very eloquent at this point. I don't know what the hell it's big long, but I'm trying to imply that there needs to be a different direction than calling back the state for certain accountability, a certain responsibility, and getting the citizens to claim a lot of our contributions back, if I'm not to say. That, I think, is the point. And what we've done here in New York, what we tried to do in Philadelphia, in terms of land, has been that. In terms of the utilization of fiscal resources, you know, at the moment, most governments give a lot of fiscal incentives to the large corporations, to the private entities, and so forth. We've been advocating and developing policy alternatives to push back from government giving those resources to these entities and figuring out ways of putting those resources into the hands of organized citizens and you know, and put it to work in a different way, no, in a different decision. So if I would project a future of a city in this direction, it would be a city where the government only serves the citizens in the way that it's allocating resources, and constructed of many different entities that are populating urban structures, you know, as such, and not one decision hand over them, nor one corporate entity over them. So that's one space, I think, that I wanted to address with the issue of autonomy pelling. I'm sure if...
say something. Immediately, I need to say something, Miguel. I think the idea of citizens in your approach, I think you take it very homogeneous. I mean, citizens are, I mean, which citizens? Who are the citizens? Most people, they prefer a governmental intervention. They want, and they are not interested with the democratization of infrastructure. So which citizen, I mean, you're speaking about? It's a very multiple, heterogeneous structure, citizens, what we call citizen. And in that sense, yes, government should serve for the citizen, but what citizens want, but it's so different that the citizens, they want gated communities, the citizens want privatization, the citizens want, I mean, not it is very strange to understand. This is why the right to the city becomes very problematic, that we had discussed once in Istanbul, that different kind of citizens, different part of communities, they want totally different property-based, possession-based rights, which they call it right to the city as well. So it's very, there was a confusion with that we had. And there is something, another little thing I want to say, sorry to intervene too much maybe, I had an interview. I did interview an architect who was working last year in Kobane, facilitating and after destruction of Kobane, the infrastructure and housing infrastructure, and he was telling me that they are working on bringing people back from Turkey who escaped from Kobane and trying to reconstruct the houses which were demolished, and they're trying to reconstruct the water system, which was not the water system, but the electricity was bombed by ISIS, and the water comes from Tigris River, and the Tigris River is a little bit lower than Kobane, and they have to pump the water to get the water. For getting the water, they need electricity and so on. So everything was interconnected: the housing, electricity, and this and that. And then there is this canton administration, and we thought always, we thinking from the news or we know from our friends. I mean, canton structure is a collective decision, heterogeneous structure. But then it came out, and I can send the interviews if we published the interview. It is a kind of a small governmental body that the decision is centralized actually, and even though it's a democratic canton, it has a harsh centralized decision making, and this is what they need because they're in a war situation. And the other thing is that the people who wanted to I mean, 45,000 people escaped from Kobane to Suruc, to Turkey, other side border. And after, I think in end of the last year, they all moved back to Kobane, and they wanted to have their houses back, 2-floor houses, 3-floor houses, 1-floor houses. And the architect, they wanted to set up assemblies to speak about common housings, cooperative, and so on. But most people from Kobane, they were not so much into that. They wanted to have their property back. So this was a little the failure of utopia. After the day, you got the revolution, you got to back the city, you want to set up cooperativism and housing and so on. But most citizens, they are not into that actually. How to deal with that? This is just a small example from one scale, you know. But how to deal with that, Miguel? This is,
Yes.
I think this is the more important, most problematic, with not only the government negotiating with the government side, but also to try to convey a common request, intent of the how we want to live together, how infrastructure can serve as a democratization, a radical democratization of in such situation. In one little neighborhood, in one scale, maybe it's more easy to in long term, but with a city, if you call citizens, yeah, nowadays many people, they want to have, many citizens, they want to have gun, they want to have a property house, they want to have privatization, they want to have high security tools everywhere around, in their house, in their company, in their street. So most citizens are like that now, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're discussing, but perhaps I did not point out that we're discussing a very different type of, or not the citizens that you're referring to. Or when I mentioned citizens, perhaps I should have argued more, instead of like the individual citizens, about organized citizens, mostly that are in a very unprivileged situation in the areas where I have been working on now. I wish I could look into, and perhaps we will, Pelin, at some point, into the war zones, you know, war areas where there's clearly very different sets of agendas, very different sets of conditions. But I don't think that what I am saying does not apply to that.
Yeah. I'm sorry, it's not only war zone I'm speaking. It was same for Istanbul.
Yeah, no, it's the same over here. Yeah, yeah. That's what I was going to say. That I think what you're saying is that it could apply everywhere else. You know, one goes out and starts to ask people what is their ideal set, you know, of living, and the majority of the times, as you say, will be private houses, fenced out most parts of the world. You go to Brazil, I can assure you that was going to be the answer, you know, an apartment in, you know, and so forth, right? And then the question comes, of course, where and how, I mean, to address the question of citizens and the citizens' demands over its government. Now, the way that I like to problematize this is the following. Government or states, since their foundation, have done somehow well in being able to provide the basic infrastructures for urbanization to happen, for commerce to, you know, to move around from one point to the other, for defining the sufficient infrastructure, which is paved roads, sewage systems, waterways, electric systems, communication systems, and so forth. And I still don't think that that type of development can be done without the state, simply because all of that type of infrastructure is debt producing. Okay, so that is no way that any private entity will go into it, and those that go into the building of highways, it's a very clear, very different type of contract and scenario where they do profit from it, but the ones that pay are most of us. But what I'm trying to say is that this type of structure development that looks beyond the local, that looks at a nation scale or a territorial scale, or that looks underneath the ground or underneath the ocean, it's something that I still cannot conceptualize as being part of any forms of citizen decision or so forth, right? So setting that as to the side, I mean, perhaps I'm making it very easy. I am more interested in the way that the government today under neoliberalism has managed to put most of its resources and has managed to empower most those that have conditioned precisely those environments and those modes of living that you, Pelling, are reflecting in your telling about citizens want this and citizens want that. If I look at my country, there's a clear class and a clear structure where most of the developers that got a lot of profit from the government incentives and fiscal incentives, where the government again was prioritizing the private industry, created a whole culture of individual housing living, you know, fenced off structures, fenced off places, and so on. And that's what I say, that that's been going on for 4 decades, if not a little bit more. There is an issue that we all have to deal with, which is the conditioning of, or the cultural conditioners of society. And without doubt, most of contemporary society today leans towards one way of living, which is the one that's been promoted by the ones that have profited the most from citizens' resources. So the way of seeing from those that have profited, I'm talking about the elites of the world, I'm talking about the big developers, I'm talking about the large corporations that have managed to create a lot of profit. They have their own way of looking at the city. And that is the way that it has reproduced. And that's the way I think that you are referring to. There's a logic of reproduction of a similar way of understanding how we should live. Now, I don't believe, Pelling, that the most repressed groups, even though they can come from the right, you know, the underpowered citizens, those that don't have homes, no, those that struggle every single day, you know, to eat more than 2 or 3 meals, you know, so on, have the same ultimate beliefs, you know, of the capitalist class that is right now dominating urban construction and the infrastructure decisions. So when I'm discussing the empowerment of specific citizenry, organized, and I should say organized citizenry, is that shift from government structures that our, again, contributions move into that space. How to make it possible that we get fiscal incentives, not for the rich, but for those underpowered communities, those disenfranchised people. You know? And I have to say, Pelling, when we started working in Rotterdam a long time ago, this is when we met each other. I mean, one of our shocking moments was that we started to work in a community in the south of Rotterdam, where most of its citizens didn't share the same values that we shared. But we understood that they were under power, that they were being exploited, that they were being abused, by a system, that they were being displaced. And therefore, we took a decision to actually support, the moving of those resources into that space. And I'm talking things beyond what is participatory budgeting. Okay, participatory budgeting right now, I mean, it's very limited. I'm talking about more power constructed into that side. So yes, we will face spelling without doubt. With in my case here in the U.S., with a bunch of Republicans, for example, that want to have their guns, and those things I think go way beyond my responsibility as an urbanist, to begin to shift the power structure into those that need it the most. And yes, spelling, most of the poor people in the United States are actually Republicans with guns. But they have been exploited like crazy. They have the less education, the less infrastructure possible, so that they can actually begin to change gradually, and understand other issues around, the world and so forth, precisely that they hopefully can understand that there are other ways of looking at the world that is not just single family housing on a gated community, and so on and so on. But it's a long process. But as long as we don't create, or we don't push the shift for moving resources from one point to the other, that reproduction of that idea of a city, or that idea of living, will continue to haunt us forever. I don't know if that's a good answer, but that's what I meant. Yeah.
Any comments?
Yes, so, unfortunately, we might have to begin wrapping up, if possible, but we can make a couple of comments.
Just really briefly, one thing that really struck me as Miguel was talking, particularly at the end, when he described, the majority of people struggling in the U.S. right now are Republicans with guns. They also believe in autonomy. And autonomy is compatible with neoliberal ideology that, you are self-sufficient, and when you try to take these people's guns away, they become really autonomous, and they go into the hills.
It's almost like one fragment of what Miguel said earlier could have fit perfectly with the libertarian agenda, right?
Libertarianism, exactly.
Anti-taxes, anti-government, give us our piece of land, because that's really the liberal kind of idea.
And the belief that once you have that separate thing, you're truly autonomous, which is ridiculous. Exactly. Yes. So, I mean, one of the issues that Castoriadis always discusses is precisely that link between self-determination, but also towards a certain larger entity that structures, in this case, the state being there. And as I say, whatever argument you can do as a libertarian or not, or whatever things, once you start discussing issues of infrastructure, it's really impossible not to put, at the conditions today, not to insert the government in it. No,
and that's the reason. Yeah, and that's the reason. One of the greatest challenges today for all of us is the question of how to recalibrate individual and collective interests. I mean, the relationship, how to recalibrate the relationship between obviously individual and collective interests, how to reinsert in what should be a kind of larger public communicational agenda an ethical dimension of basically the understanding that the survival of the individual, primarily in the United States, which has become hyper-obsessive with individual freedom, depends on the health of the community. And so doing, in so doing, I think one major challenge, which is across everything that Miguel and you also in the last thing that you were mentioning, telling of the canton and so on, is how to recalibrate what we would say kind of universal, and the universal and the particular in a sense, because I'm not going to be shy to say I still romantically want to believe in the idea of a global citizen, in the kind of co-responsibility across, beyond the nation state for caring for some ethical dimension on human rights at the global scale. But unfortunately, all of that has remained way too abstract. And what we need to somehow do is recalibrate that universal aspiration with the particularities of communities. That human rights can begin and should begin bottom up with the sensibilities of the, of the local. which obviously in many ways the local has been denigrated by institutions as provincial or backward, because obviously the hyper-local can also produce identitarian politics of protectionism and so on. So it's a very complicated set of relations and scales that would have to be opened up. And in so doing, I think that we could, another thing that we do very well from the left is that we throw the baby with the bathwater. Well, you know, just because the participatory budgets did not amount to that much, or maybe because Medellin had 4 years of progressive governance and now is vulnerable, we cannot abandon the best models that have emerged throughout time. And I think that we could become, some of us could become interlocutors of that institutional memory, recuperating traces and gestures that can be reassembled somehow. I think that it's undeniable today. For example, one project that we need in the United States desperately is we need to stop demonizing taxation. And we need to really reconceive it again as a civic duty, but obviously in relationship to a more inclusive and efficient government that is transparent. You know, somebody pointed out that in Europe, when you get your paycheck from an institution, below your salaries, all the areas where where your taxes are being invested, so there's a lot more transparency. In the US, we just get like a number. We don't know where the hell the money goes. So I think that the problem is not taxation. The problem is the inefficient and lack of transparent process by which resources are being invested and so on. So anyway, yes, how to reorient and how to recalibrate almost all of those scales to produce a new institutional model somehow. Maybe it's not totalizing. It would have to change and bend and stretch depending on context, but nevertheless, the relationship between federal, state, city, and neighborhood agendas, so that certain resources will have to benefit, as Miguel is saying, the priorities and the needs of communities. And that's the reason, to end with, I just wanted to say, there is something in the Swiss system of cantons that still interests us, but we would have to open up and criticize it. But there is a very interesting modulation between federal priorities at the scale of the nation state, but also the canton being governed locally and where these resources are distributed depending obviously on the voices of that specific community.
Where a lot of the rethinking, also in terms of local, federal things that you were mentioning to be structured around, is again another of the topics that have interested me very recently, not very recently, but like the last 2-3 years, which is the operations of supranational mechanisms, the supranational organizations in the determination of local structures. So not only following on the belief that if one elects a mayor, things will change, or if one elects a federal, you know, whatever employee or whatever the situation of scale within that you can reach to, but that most of today's decisions on urbanization are being taken by supranational organizations, which are totally undemocratic or non-democratic, and we don't know how to reach that level of activism. No, none of us, right? We know how to stay a little bit in our activism in the locale. But I always try to mention that at the time of Bloomberg here in New York, you know, had 12 years of this, where everybody blames Bloomberg, but exactly in these 12 years, most of cities around the world passed through the same levels of speculation, right? Yeah. This is not an issue of a local situation anymore. I mean, this is a complete global governance system now. And when we start talking that, of course, it's totally abstract, right? I mean, how the hell do we deal with Organization of Economic Cooperation and Developments, with the IMFs, with the European Union, with the European Central Bank, with all kinds of institutions or para-institutions, including World Trade Agreements that have their own institutionality, you know, which are basically saying to cities, this is what you should do. Today, more than ever, more than in modernism, there are urban growth formulas. The dream of homogenizing a city has been reached today with, you know, the outcomes of neoliberalism. All cities today are developing in a very, very similar way. Now, how is it? Yeah, no, including our cities like Medellin, right? I mean, like in today's situation.
Okay.
Most cities are following similar principles. And what I'm trying to argue here is that that's also something incredibly important that we need to figure, or the operation. How do we reach out to those, global entities? What is some kind of transnational form of activism on urbanization? No, and I think that's a big question, yes, for us, all of us, to figure out, because I do think that focusing in locality is not any more efficient. It has its levels of, obviously, of implication, and we cannot abandon it, but there's a whole supranational apparatus over us that it's taking a lot of decisions.
And the conversations that are taking place at that scale, powerful individuals and big, global think tanks and institutions move incredibly slow. So the problem is, while the hairs are being split at that scale, right, stuff is going on the ground and people are hurting. So figuring out how I, think about this, how to create sort of flows of information between local and global, so that as progress is being made at local scales, that knowledge is trickling up to inform institutions at broader scales about what's going on, changing policy, coming back down. But it's a very, very difficult thing to think about those correspondences. But we've, I've operated at both scales, and I became frustrated with the talking heads who talk a lot and talk a big game, but there's no mechanism for translating that back down, because they know nothing about what goes on at the bottom. They don't know anything.
But nevertheless, they impose it, no?
Categories, they don't know. They don't know, so it doesn't inform what's going on.
That's wonderful, because that's exactly, maybe to clarify the relationship of the local here, is exactly that. It's just to need to revert the terms so that the sensibilities emerge from the bottom up. They are not necessarily, they do not necessarily stay there, but they are really the DNA for transforming top-down agendas. I mean, and that journey from the bottom up to the top down needs to be facilitated, and those knowledges need to be opened up and so on and connected. And that's the reason I think that, again, we are maybe again obsessed with referring to Medellin, but that's what we saw for a moment, is that truly those years of progressive transformation of Medellin were not following a neoliberal agenda. They were, in fact, investing like no other place in the world.
We completely on that, but you know this, right? I mean, and hopefully we can have another, but I think it was talking.
That's the reason I was saying that we throw the baby with the bathwater. It's undeniable. What happened in Medellin, in the synergy of institutions and the prioritization of those bottom-up dynamics, led the city to invest in the most marginalized zones, as no other place in the world. And there is a potential there. There is the issue of progressive taxation. In Medellin, the wealthy pay more taxes than the poor. In other words, there are institutional traces that, while not perfect, need to be elevated as points of departure for something that that can get to the place we want. I think that we have to stop idealizing the kind of city where all conflicts will come to an end. I think that all we can do right now is to stitch together somehow these institutional traces that we can recombine and redeploy through our representation. I was going to mention, this is maybe one topic that we are interested about, and is the question of political representation. Because even though we think that communities can be autonomous and their sensibilities can amount to huge policy changes, again, that information needs to be represented. And more I'm thinking that artists and cultural producers can take that role, enabling a political representation of those values and the translation of those conditions, to push against institutions. But again, I truly believe that in the case of Medellin, there is a set of traces that might enable. I mean, to begin with this, I don't know if Martha knows, or maybe you, Pelin. I know that Miguel knows, but Medellin owns its own resources in a way: water, telecommunication, and energy. 40% of their dividends are poured back into public infrastructure. I mean, that in the United States would sound like socialism or communism. I mean, we cannot privatize our resources. We have to enable these other, processes to really be opened up, I guess, for more equitable development.
But I think that Medellin also shows, I mean, the initial impulse for a lot of corporate sort of, the original motivation for a lot of corporate interest to get involved in the transformation of that city was because they knew the city was falling apart, and they wanted to figure out how to transform the city into a magnet for foreign investment. So, I mean, it's a complicated story. And if you look now, there's a lot of investment, there's a lot of tourism and so forth, which is conventional. And there are pockets of the city that are typical developer-driven developments, the Poblado and the Poblado. So what I think Medellin shows is that these systems do not necessarily have to be insular. There's a codependence and a sort of an integration of private and public interests in Medellin, which I think is hugely instructive.
One final thought on that. What happened also there is that in the public-private paradigm or binary that has been perpetuated everywhere. Obviously, public-private partnerships are bullshit because most of the time it's the private that benefits, with public resources. But what they did in Medellin successfully, they inserted a third spoke into the dynamic, public, private, and community. And I think that was huge in really summoning the creative intelligence of communities, their knowledges, and it's not just rhetorical. I feel there is something there that they did, even if it lasted not that long, and I continue to have faith that it continues to last, but nevertheless, following Miguel's criticism, there is something there from which we could learn. And so I think more and more, I think is to open up and complicate, obviously, those concepts for sure.
Yeah, totally agree.
Martha, you want to say something?
Yeah, I have some old remarks based on stuff Miguel was saying. First of all, maybe I'm completely misinformed, but what I heard was a kind of sleight of hand there in the conflating of city and country, to say that the majority of poor people in the U.S. are Republicans with guns is to completely disregard the urban and the many workers at the lowest end of the scale who live in cities, whether documented or undocumented, and who the last thing they want is either a Republican in office or a gun. What they want is the basic wage security of housing, stability, and so on. And I know you know this, so I'm a little bit surprised at that. And I wonder whether you actually need this for your argument, to say that the fallback dream for those, many of whom are recent immigrants, but certainly not all, in the U.S. is this idea of the private space. Of course, it in many ways betrays the history of the 20th century, which depended on workforce, I'm going to sound like an old communist, workforce organization, union structures that helped produce housing projects and similar things. I also want to say that, of course, many states and cities in the U.S., including the more rural ones, had the idea of public utilities, by which they were referring to the idea of public ownership of resources. So it's not that it sounds like socialism. There are places in the U.S. where it still exists, and these are the most Republican areas and the most rural and the most emptied out areas. It's what you get used to. It may sound like a foreign idea when it's posed at the idea that the city ought to own its own water resources.
Yes.
But when it actually exists and the electricity is owned, as in a number of U.S. communities, both large and small, people take for granted that that's the way it should be run, unless there's a concerted, very heavy campaign to demonize it. And to get back to the idea of undemonizing taxes, well, that's an essential element of neoliberalization. is to claim that the government is the problem and why should they be taking your money. If you're going to attack that, it can't be it has to be an element of a larger cause. And my silliest argument is to say that, as far as I know, that what the Dada were objecting to was not primarily boredom, but the economies of mass death. And we can talk about the Bordian arguments about boredom and not bored, but I think that, the argument is that what mass industrial society produces is a life of repression and mass death, which is a somewhat different argument about what the stakes are. So maybe that's an irrelevant thing to be talking about, but I'm very concerned about your construction of the poor in America, or the furthest from the levers of government as those who see their best hope in an ideal of othering and hating and so on. We understand this, but this is really a rural phenomenon. It's true of the white working class in New York. That's how we got Rudy Giuliani. However, I think it's a very weak hinge for your argument.
Yeah, I mean, it is a fact, Marta, that at least the 10 poorest states in the United States, Mississippi, West Virginia, Arkansas, Alabama, Tennessee, Louisiana, etc., are the poorest, and those are the ones with largest concentrations. Yeah, the poorest citizens. The poverty rate is the biggest. The largest poverty rate is in Mississippi.
And yet the cities vote Democratic when they can.
Absolutely, and what you're discussing, of course, is urban poverty, and I was referring mostly to the most poverty in the United States, and this is I mean, at least a statistical fact. I'm not sure even the statistics might be right, but you are absolutely right that the issue of urban poverty is something that addresses other agendas. I was just trying to make an argument, and I will continue to stick to this argument, that most of the times when we deal with the most repressed parts of society, or the repressed sort of members of our society, we don't agree at all with their ideological directives. And that is an issue that Pelin was raising, in terms of what citizens, are you talking about? Are we talking about the left revolutionary citizens that are poor, that rise up, or are we talking about sort of the general victims of a predatory capitalism, which capitalism does not see these ideological differences, Marta? So I was just referring, statistically speaking, the poorest citizens of the United States are those. And in those cities, those states, yes, they're rural, but nevertheless they have a very, very large concentration, up to 20% of poverty rates. And I would even argue there's more. As you know, here in New York, we have a 50% poverty rate, more or less. Around 50% of our citizens in New York City live more or less around the poverty line or below.
The question is, are you making an argument about the need for ideological persuasion, or are you talking about actual electoral power? Because the reason that these pockets of poverty, 20%, not such a small pocket, have power is because we have a system of federalism in which those states have as much power as, say, California, in terms of ability to affect legislation. So what I'm saying is that their spokespeople promote an ideology that is not necessarily in their interest, but in terms of actual demographic representation, they don't loom that large. It wouldn't matter what they thought if they didn't have the kind of representation in.
Yeah, but we can also add the remnants, of course, of colonialist past of the United States of America. We can go all the way there, of the abuse, racial, profiling and racial abuse and so forth. I think, yes, the levels of complexity. Just to again answer, I was just trying to make a very simple, factual, statement here that most of the poor people, at least in the United States, that live under those conditions, are not ideologically aligned to what we're discussing, and then therefore should I mean, this is what Pelin brought. No, I mean, how do we deal with those things? I mean, do we select? You know, oh, I'm only going to go with our revolutionary friends on the side. I personally see all of these people incredible victims of a predatory system. I mean, whether they adopted, you know, one position or the other position, yeah, there's a very long way that we can discuss this.
Right.
But without doubt,
we're getting the hook. And since you and I actually reside in the same city for the next week, maybe we should have this argument. I think you actually diverted your own argument by bringing in the dreams of the demographically minoritarian elements of the impoverished and disenfranchised in the U.S. So everybody needs to leave so we could shoot each other directly. I have no intention to shoot you. I just thought you were derailing your own argument by kind of referring to these.
Yes, yeah.
And also, I would suggest that if given an opportunity for actual participation on a local level, they might forget their predispositions toward, as Obama said, guns and whatever, and in fact be interested in more collective forms of local organization, as long as it doesn't present itself to them as being communist or socialist, whatever.
Right.
And
yeah. I mean, I want to say this, but nevertheless, and I know will sound terrible that I'm trying to defend the people with guns. I'm totally not. But we must understand that the people that have the power today with more representation, which are the capitalist, high-end capitalist class, are not interested whatsoever in collectivity or anything like that, and they get all the benefits from the federal government. Right.
That's
so. I mean, we have to also talk about the other tools to the other side, you know, which is, in my opinion, much more criminal and much more ideologically sickening, you know, than both of them. I mean, many ways, right? But the reality is that those that have the power today, you know, are producing a situation of inequality that is absolutely extreme, and for my position, completely unacceptable, you know, to lean towards. And if I had to choose, you know, a position whether or not to serve people that I don't side ideologically with, but they are underpowered, I would choose for that rather than to continue to serve these magnets of wealth and of accumulation and of surplus and so forth, which are the capitalist class. And this is a big question, Marta, right? Because we've had panels where these panels that we have created here in your exhibition here in New York, where there's people that we don't agree with, and we've talked about it, right? And this is a big question for all of us, right? I mean, where do we position ourselves and our beliefs? In my case, anti-capitalist beliefs, or whatever you want to call them, communistic or Marxist or whatever, vis-a-vis those that are the ones that are the victims, right, of the system that I am trying to conceptualize. And the majority of them, and I guarantee you this, don't agree with all of us ideologically, right? So do we start to take sides? Because this is what has happened most of the time, right? And this is a big, big question. You know? Who are we serving in this, you know, sort of activism that we call it, right? The situation. And many people decide to serve those that think like themselves, and I obviously prefer that. But all the time that I work in a city, I'm faced with people that I totally disagree ideologically. You know, I've worked with people that hit women. I've worked with people that shout and hit their kids. No, and those are principles that for me don't apply. No, so how do we? This is a huge question that I think Pelin really posed as a very important situation to discuss.
Fonna and Teddy needs to leave. I feel that we just started.
I know.
Before we had to talk on about research also, action and so on. I mean, everything is interrelated, I think, anyway. But anyway, this is why I'm always laughing to the emails from the speakers. What are you going to talk? What are we going to talk? Pelin, who is starting? What is the structure? But then 1 2 hour, it can go very long. I want to say thank you to Fonna and Teddy and Miguel for accepting our online intercontinental
Wonderful.
seminar. I know we know is not enough, and there are many things to talk. So sorry for that, but we will come back with the transcription maybe that we can develop more. We with Martha, we will inform you about that process too. Yeah, from my side, thank you very much. Yeah, maybe Martha wants to say something too.
Oh, just thank you. Very informative and complex, and also, of course, I know nothing about Medellin, but except by rumors. So this was actually very helpful on a number of fronts. Thank you, and of course, thank you, Miguel, as ever.
Yeah.
Martha,
you.
so great to reconnect with you, Martha. Thank you, Pelin and Miguel, and let's continue the conversation.
Yes.
Thanks for involving us in this project.
Yeah.
Let the people leave. Bye-bye.
Yes.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Ciao. Thank you very much. Ciao. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.